They issued a demolition notice because the pond didn't fit the aesthetic. But when the sprinklers failed and flames reached the front porch, only what they tried to bury remained. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, because when the only water left is the one they once rejected, you'll see some things are right even before they're recognized. Clara Whitman stood still at the edge of the pond, her boots still muddy, one hand gripping the iron shovel, chipped with faded green paint. The water before her lay quiet, reflecting spring clouds shifting toward sun. Dragonflies zipped across the surface, unbothered by the man in the gray suit, standing in the middle of the yard, voice wound tight like a breaking cable. "Have you received the notice?" he asked. "If you don't voluntarily fill in the pond, within 7 days, we will proceed with enforcement." Clara turned her head slowly, as if unwilling to startle even herself. "I've submitted all the permits. The state environmental agency approved the project. I have the right to keep the pond. Individual rights cannot override community interest," the man said, raising his clipboard. "Your pond disrupts landscape uniformity, reduces neighboring property values, and violates Clause 3.4 on aesthetic consistency in the Redstone Hills HOA charter." Clara smirked, not a smile, but something halfway between fatigue and contempt. "Have you ever tried turning off the sprinkler system around here? Looked at the ground and checked the temperature? Tried standing under the sun at 3 p.m. with no shade? This pond is the only thing in this neighborhood that knows how to retain water. This isn't about the weather," he snapped. "We've had several complaints: mosquitoes, trash, standing water. Some residents feel unsafe with an open body of water in a residential area." Clara bent down, picked up a fallen leaf and dropped it into the pond. It spun once, then sank. "So when someone builds a pool, people cheer. But when I harvest rainwater, it's trash." He gripped the clipboard tighter, stepping closer. "This is a living landscape, not an ecological research station." Clara lifted her gaze. There was no fire in her eyes, but it was enough to make him take half a step back. "I used to be a water systems engineer. I've seen neighborhoods burn to the ground because they didn't have a single cubic meter of reserve. This pond isn't aesthetic. It's the last defense if the fire comes." He pointed to a camera mounted on a light pole. "We have sensors and automated sprinklers. Everything is under control." Clara let out a dry laugh. "And if your precious control fails, where will you fetch water from your charter?" He didn't respond. He only placed a final sheet on the steps. "Voluntary removal notice. Deadline, 7 days." As he left, his footsteps rang sharp against the concrete. Clara didn't move. She looked down at the pond where the sky swam on its surface. A white egret landed at the edge, lowering its beak to sip gently. She murmured, maybe to it, maybe to herself, "This world's full of things that look nice but hold nothing. Me, I'm the opposite." The next morning, Clara stepped outside and saw a sign planted just beyond her fence. "Special Supervision Area. Potential community risk. New board full color. Oversized text." It didn't name anyone, but all of Redstone Hills knew exactly who it was about. Children were forbidden to play near House 148. A mother tugged her son past and whispered, "That place has a pond. Not safe." That afternoon, Claire received an email from the HOA board titled, "Request for Voluntary Cooperation. We believe that if you truly value community harmony, you'll consider choosing a solution more aligned with the shared aesthetic of our neighborhood." Clara printed the email and pinned it to the wooden post by her front gate. Below it, she scribbled in red marker, "I didn't build this house to blend in. I live here to live." The next day, the HOA called an emergency meeting officially labeled a Small Lot Landscape Adjustment Forum. In reality, it was a thinly veiled public pressure session. An informal vote against her, Clara didn't attend. But an old neighbor friend brought her a transcript, including one bone-chilling quote from a board member. "If she won't fill the pond, let isolation do it for us." Clara read it in silence, then she went out back and sat beside the pond. The water was still, as if it too had heard. She dropped in a small float, a remnant from her days running evaporation tests in urban design projects, and watched it drift, not for data, but because she knew. Where there's water, there's movement. One evening, the HOA sent environmental surveyors, 3 men in logo jackets. They circled her fence, taking photos, measuring, muttering, shaking their heads. They didn't knock, didn't ask. Their presence alone said enough. Clara wasn't being treated like a resident, she was being managed. She didn't react. That night, she wrote a reply. Email calm, precise, attached with legal zoning maps. Her pond permit is state water agency approval, in last year's full environmental assessment, which concluded rainwater retention pond at lot 148 poses no pollution. Risk attracts no insect activity beyond thresholds and qualifies as an emergency use model for water storage. She hit send, shut the laptop. Outside on the porch, frogs croaked across the surface of the pond. A real sound, not from the HOA's approved soundscape. Ambience playlist. Clara leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She whispered, "People fear what they can't control, but it's always those same things that save them when they lose control." The fifth day after receiving the enforcement notice, Clara found a rigid envelope in her mailbox embossed with the HOA's logo. Inside wasn't an official order, but a neighborhood consensus petition, bearing over 30 signatures. Among them, names that had once sipped tea on her porch, asked for cuttings from her garden, laughed under her shade. The petition urged Clara to cease actions that disrupt community unity by defending an inappropriate landscape element. At the bottom, underlined in red, "We stand together for consistency, not against anyone but in love of order." Clara held the paper. Her hand didn't tremble, but her eyes were heavier than usual. Some neighbors no longer looked at her when walking by. The delivery driver now left packages 3 meters outside the fence, never stepping into the yard. A child who once biked lazy circles around the pond was now pulled away by a watchful parent. Clara understood. They didn't need to force her to leave. They just had to make her feel like she didn't live here anymore. She brewed tea, sat on the porch, placed the petition beside her, not as proof of harm, but as a reminder. On the wooden table, a topographic map of the area, a folder with land use rights and 2 old reports. One, a rainwater simulation project she once led in drought-prone neighborhoods. The other, her post-mortem analysis of a wildfire from a neighboring county where an entire block burned because the sprinkler system failed 3 minutes late. That evening, she lit the garden lamps and angled them at the pond. The surface glowed like a mirror. She didn't see her reflection in it, but she saw clearly the one thing no one around her dared say. They weren't punishing her for being wrong. They were punishing her for the possibility that she might be right. Overnight, a light rain fell. By morning, the pond brimmed its highest level all season. Clara ran standard tests: turbidity, bacterial presence, pH, all results perfect. But in the mailbox, another envelope waited, this time from the HOA Environmental Safety Committee. It requested immediate suspension of pond usage pending independent reassessment by a board-approved third party. Clara laughed, a dry, sharp sound. She wondered if a fire broke out tomorrow, would they ask whether her water had passed inspection, or just start scooping it with anything they could grab? She opened her laptop and began typing a formal reply. "I don't need to prove this pond is safe. I only need to remind you when your system fails. The only thing left standing might be the very thing you're trying to bury." On the 7th night after the enforcement notice, the air was blistering. Heat pressed in like a wayad, and the wind blowing hard from the west was dry, laced with a faint scorched scent. Not from a grill, not from any oven. It was the kind of smell only those who'd worked with fire would recognize. Clara opened her window, tilted her head. Milo, the once stray dog she'd taken in 2 years ago, let out a low growl. She rose, crossed the room to her cabinet, and pulled down the wind direction gauge and the air quality board from the wall. PM levels spiked. Wind shift, and then she saw it, a dull orange smear glowing beyond the far row of houses. Not flickering, not warm, but smudged and furious, like the mouth of something alive and burning. Sirens pierced the night from the east, wildfire warning. Clara ran to the backyard. The pond was full, still warm from a day of sunlight, but clear. No algae, no film, just water. Hole waiting. She yanked a heavy-duty hose across the lawn, unlocked the main valve, and picked up the phone. "This is Clara Whitman at 148. I have a stormwater retention pond certified. If your team needs a water source nearby, it's ready." A pause, 3 full seconds. Then we're en route. Less than 10 minutes later, fire trucks swarmed into Redstone Hills. The HOA's internal pipeline system, the one they'd touted as state-of-the-art, fully autonomous, had lost pressure. Main tank offline. Useless firefighters sprinted into Clara's yard, checked the pond. Depth, good, clarity, good. They hooked up a portable pump, extended the hose, and within 2 minutes, water flowed not from HOA copper, but from what they'd called non-compliant. The blaze halted at the 3rd property line. Some rooftops singed at the edges, but no homes fell, no lives lost, not because of the system, but because of a pond. By morning, the flames were out. Light crept down across the backyard, hitting the surface now, nearly a handbreadth lower than it was the night before. A young firefighter turned to Clara. "If this pond hadn't been here, we'd have lost the West Block." "You know that, right?" Clara nodded. She didn't say "I told you so." She just turned her gaze toward the front yard where the sign still stood, crooked and charred. Special Observation Zone. Community risk present. She didn't tear it down. She left it to remind them all. Sometimes what they watch is the very thing that saves them from the fire. The next morning, while ash still clung to rooftops and fire engines had just cleared the main street, an email landed in the inbox of every Redstone Hills resident sent from the HOA management office. It bore that familiar sterile subject line. Regarding the fire on the 14th Acknowledgement Assessment and Action. The message stretched across 4 paragraphs. The first praised the swift response of emergency services. The second thanked residents for their cooperation and orderly evacuation. The third cited the unexpected nature of the event and the temporary failure of the automated water system due to upstream pressure loss. And the final paragraph was a hollow thud. "We will review future contingency measures." Not a single word about the pond, not a mention of the woman at house 148. "No, thank you. No, we were wrong. No, we're sorry." Clara read it all. She didn't flinch. She printed the email, folded it in thirds, and tucked it into a folder labeled "Proof." When even fire speaks, they still don't listen. But not everyone stayed silent. That afternoon, 3 children knocked on her door. One of them, the same boy once banned from playing near her yard for pond risk, held up a small glass jar. Inside pond water. "Can we take some to school?" Our teacher asked if we had anything that helped the grown-ups last night. Clara smiled. "Next time, take more. I'll show you how to filter it properly." The kids sat on her porch all afternoon sketching the pond. None of them asked why they'd been banned before, and Clara didn't explain. Because sometimes truth doesn't need repeating when people are already living inside its outcome. That evening, someone else arrived. Travis, the HOA representative, who'd once delivered the enforcement notice, walked up the path. No clipboard, shirt wrinkled, eyes unsure. "I just wanted to check how the pond's doing." Clara didn't answer at first. She gestured to the water already refilled, halfway from that morning's rain. "It doesn't need praise, it just needs it to be left alone." Travis nodded, swallowing whatever apology hadn't formed fully. Turning to leave, he muttered, "Maybe we underestimated the actual utility of some elements in the guidelines." Clara's gaze never left the water. "You didn't underestimate. You just prioritized the wrong things. And fortunately, fire doesn't ask for your opinion before it comes." 3 days after the fire, the Redstone Hills HOA issued a notice calling for an emergency meeting to review and update landscape policies in response to rapidly changing environmental conditions. In the community hall, the same place where Clara had once been outvoted in absentia, she was now invited as a professional with expertise in water resource management. She didn't speak first. She sat quietly in the back row, her hand resting on the folder she had prepared long ago before anyone believed fire would ever come. The first to rise wasn't an HOA board member. It was Ramon, 67, who lived at the end of the street and who had once signed the petition asking Clara to fill in her pond. He removed his glasses and said clearly, "When the fire truck stopped in front of my house, they didn't ask where the HOA system was. They asked, does her pond still have water? I'm not proud of my old vote, but I'm proud someone in this neighborhood didn't bend to pressure, so that pond was still there when we needed it." No one applauded, but no one interrupted. Then Felicia, who had once filed a complaint about frogs disturbing children's sleep, stood and asked, "Have we been so focused on what's pretty that we forgot what actually holds up?" A quiet wave of nods moved through the room. When Clara was invited to speak, she didn't say "I told you so." She simply opened her folder, pulled out the backup water map, fire risk assessments, and a quote from an HOA report dated 3 years earlier. Redstone Hills is not considered a high-risk fire zone due to its automated sprinkler system. She pointed to the line. "I don't know if you ever lacked risk, but overconfidence that you had in surplus." Then she placed a proposal on the table amendment to HOA regulations for climate adaptation, allowing personal water retention systems that meet state environmental standards. No one objected. 1 week later, Redstone Hills approved its first bylaw revision in 12 years, legalizing rainwater collection within safety limits, permitting adaptive ecological landscaping, and banning aesthetic-based enforcement rooted in undefined standards. Clara didn't celebrate. She simply stood by her pond watching the water reflect a new sign posted near the neighborhood entrance, Climate-Responsive Community, where we keep what matters, even if it didn't look familiar at first. 1 month after the fire, the county government hosted a public forum on climate adaptation and residential planning. Clara was invited as a community speaker, a title that to her felt off. She wasn't an activist, she didn't perform. She just refused to throw away something she knew would one day matter, just because others didn't yet understand why. At the conference, when the host introduced her as the woman who kept a pond and saved a neighborhood, Clara simply stepped up, leaned into the mic and said, "I didn't keep the pond. The pond kept itself. I just refuse to listen to people who think something only has value once they've approved it." The room went quiet, not out of shock, but because the words landed true. At the same time, a group of urban planning students interviewed Clara for a project called Unconventional Landscapes and Lessons from the Environment. One of them asked, "Do you think the HOA reacted out of fear? Fear of something they couldn't control?" Clara nodded. No one likes relying on what they didn't design, but nature didn't sign your regulations, it just does what it does. And if you don't make room for it to work, it'll teach you in other ways. Back in Redstone Hills, change didn't come all at once, but the direction had shifted. One homeowner applied to install a rainwater barrel approved. A family asked to convert their lawn to native gravel, and drought-tolerant plants offered technical assistance. An elderly man who once secretly kept fish in a stone pond now proudly showed off his tank and taught neighbor kids to feed them. At the next HOA meeting, the board proposed naming Clara as volunteer ecological advisor. She declined. Instead, she sent back a small envelope, a clean folder with a handwritten note. "I don't need a title. I just want the next time someone asks to try something new, you actually listen before you say, 'doesn't fit.'" And in a quiet and announced gesture of acknowledgement, the HOA updated its bylaws. Under Section 6.7 now, read, "Any design not included in the standard template lab, but supported by ecological rationale or scientific merit, shall be prioritized for review and not presumed non-compliant." Clara heard the news from a neighbor. She didn't react. She simply looked down at the pond, now shimmering with moonlight, and softly said, "Maybe the pond didn't just hold water. Maybe it held our ability to learn again, especially for those who once thought they knew it all." One mid-month morning, with the mist still clinging to the pond's surface, a group of elementary school students arrived, led by their teacher. There were no signs, no plaques, only the story passed down. This is where someone kept a pond, despite opposition, and that pond helped save an entire neighborhood. A young boy stepped close to the edge and asked Clara, "Did you know the fire was going to happen?" She smiled, "No, but I knew that if it ever did, and I wasn't ready, no explanation would matter afterward." A girl chimed in, "Why did people want to cover the pond?" "It's pretty." Clara paused for a moment, then said, "Because people often believe what doesn't look like. The majority must be dangerous. But the truth is, it's usually the things the majority overlooks that end up saving them." When the visit ended, the children left a small wooden mailbox outside Clara's gate, filled with hand-drawn pictures, short letters, and one scribbled note that read, "You are the grandma of the pond." Clara kept the box by her kitchen window. Every time she walked past it, she looked a quiet reminder that she hadn't lived in vain. That same month, a housing and planning journal interviewed her. In the article, they called her the lone woman who changed how the suburbs think about water retention. Clara disliked the headline. She sent the editors a letter requesting they revise the closing sentence to say, "She didn't change anything. She just refused to pretend the pond was wrong, when it had been right all along." That evening, Clara walked a slow circle around the pond. The water was full clear, reflecting the ember-streaked sky of sunset. By the bank, the fern she'd planted last year now stood knee-high. Sparrows had nested in the lattice by the fence. No one removed them. No one filed a complaint. She sat down, gently traced a circle on the water with her hand, and then she said softly to herself, or perhaps to someone in the future, "I didn't save anyone. I just kept what I knew was right, and sometimes that alone is enough." 6 weeks after the fire, Clara's name was mentioned in a California State Legislative Committee hearing when a representative proposed a new bill, Bill 1185, the right to retain personal water storage in private residential communities. Attached to the bill's dossier was a satellite map image, Redstone Hills, with a single red dot marking Clara's pond, and the fire perimeter stopping precisely there. A local news station invited Clara for an on-air interview. She declined. So they sent a reporter to her home instead. Do you see yourself as proof that sometimes old civil codes need to be challenged? By real-world experience, he asked. Clara simply sipped her tea and replied quietly, I didn't challenge anything. I just didn't let people cover up what was right because it didn't look nice. That single sentence spread quickly. A short clip of her quote racked up over 2 million views in 3 days. In the comments section, people posted photos of rain barrels, native gardens, low-impact drainage systems, and wrote, I kept my ugly too. Turns out it was worth it. Soon, HOA communities across the state faced mounting pressure to revise outdated regulations. Civil rights organizations filed complaints against policies that illegally hindered individual environmental resilience. A group of law students launched a campaign called #RightToStore, encouraging residents to report unreasonable water retention bans and respond using the precedent known as Clara's case. Clara's home, once marked with a special monitoring zone sign, had now become a destination for young environmental engineers studying low-tech, high-sense design, the kind that doesn't require permission to work. They started calling it the Learning Pond, a place where the law learns from nature. One afternoon, Clara received a letter from a distant town in the Mojave Desert. It was written by an elderly woman. I built a small pond like yours. My HOA told me to fill it in because it lacked positive visual impact. But I remembered what you said, water doesn't need praise to save lives. I'm keeping mine. Thank you for staying where you were when everything tried to make you leave. Clara folded the letter and placed it in her wooden box, the one she called soft evidence. Then she walked out back and looked over the pond, glowing in the late sun. Milo dashed through the grass, chasing dragonflies. No one had signed off on this moment. No one authorized its existence, but it existed anyway. And for Clara, that was everything. Less than 3 months after the fire, the name Clara Whitman had become a symbol, often extending far beyond her own story. Environmental groups used her name in their campaigns. Urban designers used images of her pond in ecological planning slides. A series of online videos even turned her into an animated character, the woman who stood against a whole neighborhood with just a shovel. Clara wasn't offended, but she wasn't entirely comfortable either, because in those versions, the pond became a miracle. She was cast as a heroic resistor, and the residents of her former HOA were flattened into one-dimensional villains, blind, ignorant, unreasonable. But the truth wasn't that pretty, and Clara wasn't someone who liked her truths sugar-coated. At an urban architecture conference where she was invited to speak, the host introduced her with the phrase, the mother of suburban resilience. Clara stepped up, looked around the room and said, I'm not the mother of anything. I just dug a pond. When no one else thought holding water mattered. I wasn't fighting anyone. I just didn't move when someone told me to, just so they'd feel more comfortable. The room fell silent, but this silence wasn't confusion. It was respect. After her talk, a young woman approached Clara, a newly graduated landscape architect. She handed Clara a design sketch for a new residential model. Minimal lawn, more stone, small backyard ponds lined with natural materials. In the corner of the blueprint was a line of text inspired by the Whitman principle. Not all beauty needs to match. Clara studied the design for a long moment, then asked, have you ever been told your designs looked wrong? The young woman nodded. More than once, they said I didn't care about the visual experience of others. Clara answered. Then they're confusing looking with living, and real design is for living, not for display. That week, a legal journal published a piece titled The Legality of Functional Aesthetics, Lessons from Clara Whitman. Its closing sentence was widely quoted. A pond isn't an act of defiance, it's a refusal to be silent from someone who knows what happens when we only build what's approved. Clara printed the article, but she didn't hang it on the wall. She tucked it into her notebook, the one where she was drafting plans to expand the pond, a few more water retention cells, a small wetland corner for natural filtration, and a rainwater channel from the roof. She wasn't doing it for praise, she was doing it so no one would have to apologize ever again for not listening early enough. April of the following year, the state government of California officially adopted a new guideline for climate-adaptive community design. Within it, there was a modest clause that engineers began informally calling the Clara Standard. It wasn't a rigid regulation, Just a single sentence. Residential areas should accommodate small-scale water retention solutions initiated by residents provided they are scientifically sound and meet safety standards even if they don't align with traditional aesthetic norms. Just one line. But it forced hundreds of HOAs across the state to re-examine their outdated rules. Places that once banned standing water had to learn how to store it. Neighborhoods that fined people for digging. Rain trenches began hiring consultants. To learn how to keep water in place, among the consultants invited was Clara. She didn't accept every request, but she chose a few communities, especially the newer ones, the ones not yet hardened by habits of visual control. One afternoon in Riverside, she attended a review of a new neighborhood blueprint. When the lead architect asked, "What kind of backyard standards should we set? Not too loose, but still flexible." Clara didn't look at the plans. She simply asked, "Who's going to live here?" "Mostly young families," he replied. "Any of them ever lost a home to fire?" she asked. The architect hesitated. "I don't know." Clara smiled. "Then don't set the standard. Let them help shape it." She wrote a single line on the draft. Each resident should have the right to keep at least one non-standard element as long as they're responsible for it. That sentence was kept untouched in the final version. At Redstone Hills, 1 year after the fire, the neighborhood looked different. Not because of big changes, but because small changes were now allowed. One home had a rooftop water collection system. Another had native fish in a backyard pond. A wall bore a mural to reflect heat. And in the center of it all, Clara's pond still full. That evening, several members of the newly elected HOA board visited Clara's home. They brought a small plaque, not large, not flashy, and asked if they could place it near the edge of the pond. It read, "A source of life, never needing permission, only someone brave enough to keep it," Clara agreed. Not because she needed the plaque, but because maybe someone someday would need to read it when standing at the edge of a choice to bow or to preserve something not yet accepted. That summer, Redstone Hills entered the worst drought in a decade. Lawns withered across the neighborhood. Ornamental garden beds, once HOA approved, in aesthetic turned yellow and brittle. The automated irrigation system, once touted as efficient, was restricted by city mandate. But right in the center of it all, what had once been called a visual blemish, Clara's pond remained clear, full, and cool. It wasn't magic. Months earlier, Clara had rerouted rainwater from her roof into the pond, filtering it through handmade gravel beds and storing every drop. A group of UCLA students visited for their senior project. The viability of unregulated green infrastructure in aesthetics, limited urban design. They sat on Clara's porch, notebooks in hand, sipping cold water. One of them asked, "Do you ever feel exhausted having to fight the whole system just to keep one pond?" Clara replied without hesitation, "I'm not fighting the system. I just refuse to give up what's right, just so someone else can feel right about it." The following week, a nonprofit mailed Clara an honorary award, Pioneer in Residential Climate Adaptation for Community Resilience. She thanked them but declined to attend the ceremony. Her response was short, "I didn't do it to be honored. I did it so someone tomorrow doesn't need permission to do what's necessary." In Redstone Hills, the pond behind Clara's house started being called the ground mirror, not because it reflected faces, but because it reflected how a community came to see itself. One afternoon, a little boy swam in the pond, then climbed up, panting. "Miss Clara," he asked, "how come your pond always stays full?" Clara smiled. "Because I didn't build it to stay full. I built it so when it runs low, it still has somewhere to fill." That night, Clara sat by the pond longer than usual. The sky was clear, the water still beyond the fence. Kids giggled. The air smelled of dry wind, wild herbs, and honest soil. Everything had quieted. Not because Clara had changed, but because finally, people stopped trying to change her. Sunday morning, Clara woke up earlier than usual. Not for any particular reason. Just because the dew that day lay thick on the pond's surface and she liked watching the water blur before the sun had a chance to dry it. Milo, slower now with age, stepped out onto the porch, then lay down, resting his head on her leg, breathing softly. The neighbors were used to that scene. No one avoided her anymore. Some even brought coffee over, sitting by the fence, chatting about how their cat fell into the pond yesterday and swam right back out. Clara nodded, sometimes smiled. No one apologized for their old votes, and she didn't need them to. Because some things once quieted make forgiveness unnecessary. Simply by no longer being at war at the nearby elementary school, Clara's pond became part of a unit in the curriculum, the value of local solutions. A teacher told her that one third-grade student, when asked, "What would you build for your neighborhood?" had answered, "I want to dig a little pond, so that if someone says I can't, I'll tell them Clara did it first." Clara laughed softly, not out of pride, but because she knew that child wouldn't be alone if they ever had to defend something true by themselves. She still kept her nightly habit of writing by hand. Nothing long, just one line a day. That evening she wrote, "The pond is no longer against the rules." But even when it was, it still held water, and that was enough. Beside her notebook sat a wooden box where Clara stored drawings, letters, and little notes from those who had visited, who had learned something from the pond. She didn't reread them all, but now and then she'd take one folded in half and slip it in her pocket like an ID card, to remember she once had a reason not to step back. And whenever someone asked her, "Didn't you feel alone holding your ground in a neighborhood that fought you?" Clara simply replied, "If I was right and still remained myself, maybe I was never really alone at all." One afternoon in mid-June, Clara received a small parcel, no return address. Inside was a softly faded photograph. A small backyard pond, the water modest, ringed with river stones, a few reeds growing along its edge. Tucked behind it, a handwritten note in uneven but clear lettering. "I don't know if my pond is beautiful, but thanks to yours, I know I don't need permission to keep something." "I believe is right." Clara folded the photo and set it on the kitchen table next to her half-finished cup of tea. For the first time in a long while, she felt a tiredness behind her eyes. Not from overwhelm, but from a quiet knowing. What she had done was no longer just her. That same week, a group of young engineers launched a project called A Pond for Every Roof, inspired by Clara's model. They didn't use her name, but every story, every blueprint traced back to that one prominent article about the Redstone Hills fire. They visited small towns, ran workshops, taught how to harvest rain, build natural filters, restore soil, all the things Clara had once been dismissed for trying. They invited her to serve as an honorary advisor. She declined, but sent them a short voice recording, just a few words. "Don't try to be like me, do the right thing even if no one else has yet. And if someone asks who gave you permission, tell them the land did, the sky did, the water did. That's enough." The media kept mentioning her name, but Clara stopped reading. She preferred tending her garden, tuning the filter system, teaching the neighborhood kids how to test water quality, not to build a new generation of pond protectors, but because she believed if even one child learns to see water as something worth keeping, they might one day learn to see people that way too. That evening, when one of the kids asked Miss Clara, "What if someday no one needs the pond anymore? Does it still matter?" Clara smiled gently. "The point isn't whether anyone uses it. It's that if someone ever does, it's still here." One July afternoon, Clara walked out to the pond earlier than usual. The sky was gray, the wind light, but not cool, the kind of weather that warns of a heavy rain on the way. She checked the drainage trench, opened the auxiliary valve, gathered dry twigs along the bank. Every movement practiced quiet, unprompted, but seen. When the rain came, no one panicked. The kids kept playing. The grown-ups stood under porch roofs, sipping coffee, pointing at the clouds, guessing how long the storm would last. Someone said, "Enough to fill Clara's pond again." No mockery in their tone, just a simple, accepted fact. After the rain passed, Clara stepped outside to check the water level. A young boy ran up, breathless. "Miss Clara, today I saw my mom bring new neighbors to see the pond. She told them, 'This place is different from other communities. Here we have water saved for everyone. We live a little slower here, but safer.'" Clara smiled. "Your mom's right." That evening, passing by the community gate, Clara saw a new sign, freshly hung Redstone Hills, where you're allowed to keep what you believe as long as you're willing to stand by it. No one put her name on that quote, but everyone knew where it came from. In her notebook that night, Clara wrote one line: "People no longer ask why the pond is here. Now they ask how to build one like it. That's how I know I don't have to stand in the center anymore, because what's right can stand on its own." Lately, Clara spoke less. Not from weariness, but because there was nothing left to defend. She spent more time planting soft grasses around the edge, teaching kids how to build downspouts that carried rainwater into barrels. They asked a lot of questions, not because they doubted, but because they wanted to know. Once she asked them back, "Why don't you ask the engineers?" a child replied. "Because you're the first one who didn't wait for permission, so you probably know best where to begin." Clara was quiet for a moment, then she nodded. Not out of pride, but because finally the pond had become an answer, one that no longer needed a question. I'm my Shimakawa boss. An early autumn morning, Clara woke later than usual. The breeze was cool, the sky clear. Outside the pond, surface lay still like glass, reflecting nothing special. Just the sky, a few clouds, and the shape of the ferns she'd planted last year, now grown tall enough to reach her window. She poured tea, sat on the porch steps like every day. Milo, older, now slower, lay beside her feet, eyes half closed. No one knocked, they didn't need to. The neighborhood had long grown used to the pond, as if it had always been there, never questioned. And maybe that's true, the things most essential often survive the longest arguments. That evening, Redstone Hills hosted a small outdoor gathering. Not an HOA meeting, no invitations, no agenda, just neighbors circling up, sharing stories about small changes they once feared to make. A couple spoke of keeping their late mother's stone wall, even though it broke the visual rhythm. A young man told how he turned his roof into a garden, and somehow every story curved gently back to the pond. When it came to her turn, Clara didn't stand, she spoke from her chair. I didn't build the pond to teach anyone anything. I built it because I knew one day we'd need water when the tap wouldn't turn. And in that moment, beauty, approval, design, none of it would matter if no one had saved space for what we once thought we'd never use. Silence followed, but the kind of silence that understands. Later that night, a little girl brought Clara a card on it, a drawing of the pond, some grass, Milo, and a handwritten line in uneven crayon. Thank you for not filling it in. Clara folded the card, slipped it into her jacket pocket. She looked around, not searching, not avoiding, the pond on the far side still quiet. And even though no one mentioned it anymore, she knew the pond had done what it came to do. Not by saving anyone, but by teaching them not to dismiss what they don't yet understand. That night, a breeze stirred water murmured. Clara sat on the porch, hand resting on Milo's head, eyes closed. Not from weariness, but because, finally, she no longer had anything to guard. What's held in place by conviction will know how to stay. Arjun, thank you for following Clara's story. The woman who kept a pond and kept a whole neighborhood's chance to understand why, if you believe that something doesn't need to fit the mold to deserve to exist, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with anyone who's ever held on to what's right, even when they were told it didn't look like everyone else.